So yeah, maybe before we get stuck in, just do a very quick round of introductions.
I'm Steve Edwards with South Pole. Oh, should I give longer than that, or I don't know how this. That was quick.
We're good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll have time to get into more time to get into the media stuff. But yeah, I guess you're from a sort of biodiversity expertise, but coming into a carbon world.
Yes, thank you. This is now we're getting off to a great start here. Steve Edwards, Global Director for Biodiversity for South Pole. 1 month in the role, so please don't ask me historical questions about South Pole's work. My remit within the company is to map out a strategy and a direction for how we're going to work on Biodiversity Credits. So this is a very relevant panel as well as conference for me and that issue. But beyond that, also looking across the company in terms of how we're interacting with biodiversity as an issue, and how do we ensure alignment across the different services that we provide to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi everyone, I'm Sinclair Vincent, Director of Sustainable Development Innovation at Verra. So in that role, I look after all of our non-greenhouse gas programs to ensure that they stay fit for purpose and evolve over time, as well as developing new programs or programmatic elements kind of outside the carbon space. So that includes what we call our nature framework, which is our biodiversity accrediting methodology, so leading the development of that, as well as looking after safeguards and other sustainable development components of our carbon program, of which there are a lot of linkages with the nature framework.
Right, hi, I'm Tim Coles. I'm CEO of a company called rePLANET, and what we do is restore ecosystems using carbon and biodiversity credits. My background is in biodiversity. I spent a lifetime doing biodiversity surveys in one form or another for the last 20 years, running international teams, quantifying biodiversity in lots of different habitats, and published 650 papers from those teams on how it works in practice. So we're practical ecologists that are now trying to apply how you quantify a unit of biodiversity change. Because once you've got that unit of biodiversity change, in the same way as you've got a ton of carbon dioxide for climate change, once you've got that unit of change, then from there on in, it's relatively easy to develop credits. And I hope in this discussion we can talk a little bit about what is a realistic unit of biodiversity change that most of us can agree on.
Great. And before we get to that, so Steve, for someone, when you're speaking to someone who's mainly coming into this from a carbon credits or carbon markets background, how is biodiversity different, and how does that influence the design of biodiversity credits?
I think that's a really important issue to discuss here, and as we're wrapping up these 2 days of discussions, one of the things that is clear to me, coming from a predominantly biodiversity background, I worked prior to coming here at International Union for the Conservation of Nature for 10 years, and prior to that, Conservation International for 15 years, both very focused on the nature agenda. The biodiversity credits are not equal to carbon credits. They're not the same thing. We need to be careful in our discussions that we don't conflate the two of them. There are lessons to be learned. There are useful approaches and methodologies and platforms that are beneficial to advancing a biodiversity credit agenda, and lessons learned throughout the development of the voluntary carbon market that should be heeded as the biodiversity credit market is further developed. But it's important to acknowledge that biodiversity, by its very nature, is about complexity, diversity, and so that doesn't lend itself easily to coming up with single units. It's hard because biodiversity is local for the most part, and so those are very different considerations than the carbon world, where you can have offset for emissions that occur in the UK, could be offset in Madagascar, and so that contributes to the atmosphere. It doesn't really matter where on the planet that it happens, but biodiversity considerations are predominantly local, not exclusively. And there's other really important distinctions that we have to consider. Much of the discussions about the use of biodiversity credits is as a completely voluntary measure that is beyond, different than obligations to offset negative impacts to nature. And so I'm already seeing a lot of confusion in terms of terminology and approaches, and I think it'll be in our interest to bring greater clarity to what are those considerations. Other important differences are that, you know, when a carbon credit is retired, we're done with it, right? Biodiversity credits are permanent, right? We have to continue to invest and engage in the maintenance of nature. The timescales are different. The issues that we'll be touching within each biodiversity intervention may be different. There will be different types of species, different timeframes, different intervention strategies for helping conserve them. So these are all things that that we should be cognizant of as we move forward in this exploration. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And yeah, on the important point that biodiversity is local and by definition extremely diverse, Tim, can you explain to us how you can go about actually having a unit of biodiversity change or unit of biodiversity protected that is tractable given the sheer diversity, taxonomic, phylogenetic, biogeographic, between realms? How do you compare a unit of biodiversity change in a coral reef in a tropical rainforest?
Okay, well, firstly, do you need it at all? And I think it's absolutely essential. Can you imagine the carbon world without a definition of what a unit of carbon is? Well, that's effectively what we're trying to operate in the biodiversity world. Imagine you are a company that's investing, let's say, in a Borneo project with orangutans, and you're working in the Caribbean as well. What do you put in your ESG report at the end of it? You know, we've got a couple more orangutans, and the parrotfish are doing quite well in the Caribbean. There's no way you could actually put it into a unit that can be comparable between those. And that's why it's important to look at the definition, which we think is a 1% gain, and the gain means either uplift or avoided loss per hectare in the median value of a basket of taxa that reflect the conservation objectives of your site. So if you're, for example, trying to protect a coral reef in Indonesia from bomb fishing and cyanide fishing, then you'd use metrics like a rugosity, how many nooks and crannies there are in it, coral cover, species richness and abundance of piscivorous fish, the same for herbivorous fish, and species richness and biomass of commercially exploited invertebrates. Now, that would be a good description of an improved reef. It's absolutely useless when you come to rewilding a farm in England. You don't want any of those metrics. They're not going to work, because there you're going to look at a completely different basket of metrics. But if you can measure those metrics at time 1, and then again at time 2, each of the different taxa will have changed by a different percentage. Improved, we hope. And if you take the median value of that and multiply it by hectares, you've then got the numbers of units of biodiversity gain that you can achieve for a particular project. That then does allow you to compare projects between different ecosystems. So we're getting close in our world, surprisingly, to getting some agreement. I think everyone's agreed that, well, not everybody, pretty well everybody's agreed that a unit of biodiversity is a percentage gain per hectare. We've just got to refine it down a little bit more. I think using that basket of metrics approach, and it's very close to what Verra are doing as well, to be able to come up with a definition that generally people are agreed on, and then there can be a multiplicity of methods. That's fine. We should have competition, but we need that definition sorting out, and that's, I think, is the biggest barrier to this whole thing scaling.
Thanks. And maybe drawing on another important point on the introduction about how biodiversity credits are different, is the important thing that a lot of biodiversity credit standards are converging on, that they really are not biodiversity offsets. So it's really not, you've built a big hole in the ground, but it's okay because you've bought biodiversity credits and now you're all good. Sinclair, why is it important that biodiversity credits are not offsets? And what kind of claims can companies therefore make about a biodiversity credit? What is a buyer of a biodiversity credit really getting?
Yeah, I think this is really important, and Steve touched on this a little bit about the nature of biodiversity and that it is local. And so unlike a ton of CO2, where it doesn't really matter where you're reducing or sequestering that CO2 because it's a global issue, biodiversity is local. You can't say, you can't destroy a part of biodiversity in the Amazon and purchase a biodiversity credit somewhere in Africa and say that you've compensated for your impacts. They're very different ecosystems, different species. It just wouldn't be appropriate. And so that's why it's difficult to come to agreement on what the exact unit is. But that's also why it's important that we make it clear that these voluntary standards and methodologies are not to be used for offsetting. But what does that mean for a company? And I think that's part of the conversation we've sort of left to the sideline for a little bit too long. So yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about it here today. It still needs, purchasing a credit still has to have a purpose and matter for a company to actually do it. And I think that's one of the bigger barriers to scaling the market. Open for debate of what the barriers are, but I certainly think this is one of them. And I think it's not too difficult to solve, but it will take some education on all of our parts to work with companies and investors and financial institutions to really kind of break apart the use case and what these credits represent for a company or any kind of buyer. I think a lot of this is going to come from Target 15 and the Global Biodiversity Framework, where companies, large corporates, and financial institutions are meant to be reporting, well, first quantifying and disclosing their impacts and dependencies on nature. As we've heard, I think, across the last 2 days, generally once you have to report on an impact, you would like to be able to say what you're doing about that impact. So I do think we'll start to see companies kind of waking up to what their impact is on nature, and then perhaps more importantly, what their dependency is on nature. If your company, and particularly in sectors where you have a supply chain that is very dependent on nature, it is in your best interest to invest in that nature that you rely on if you want your company to survive into the future. So talking about sustainability, both in the sense of environmental ecosystem sustainability, as well as your business's sustainability to operate. So I think we'll start to see businesses understand that they depend on nature and need to invest in that beyond any sort of mitigation that they may do locally, particularly if they're required to do so where they're based. And then investing in nature or biodiversity credits in a voluntary space to kind of go beyond their value chain and secure their supply chains into the future. So I think that's what we'll see, as well as recognizing that there are legacy impacts that have already taken place, and already, we see this across landscapes, including unattributable impacts. And so I think we could see and should encourage sectors that maybe as a sector, but can't really pinpoint to one company, have had impacts on biodiversity and could use these voluntary mechanisms to kind of turn that around and invest in restoring or preventing further impacts from taking place.
Thanks. And so positive investments beyond the mitigation hierarchy sounds a lot like the concept of nature positive. But it's interesting that Steve, in your opinion, why does nature positive implementation require biodiversity credits? Why have these conversations not really happened together, and do you see them converging?
There has been, for those of you that aren't tuned into it or haven't been hearing about it, there has been an increasing amount of discussions around the concept of what is nature positive. There was a recent launch of a nature positive initiative that includes a number of prominent organizations and institutions and working groups like the TNFD, like SPTN, World Economic Forum, and many others, WBCSD, promoting the idea of nature positive and things that can be done above and beyond addressing negative impacts. And so that's a good sign. That's a good direction. It's moving away from what has been the discourse in terms of addressing negative impacts of development towards making positive contributions towards nature conservation. That doesn't mean that we can forget that we've done what we need to do in terms of addressing the negative impacts, by the way. That's a job still left incomplete, and we need to keep a very close eye on that. However, it is more of an optimistic approach and opportunity and space for companies to contribute to doing things that are useful and good, as Sinclair mentioned, perhaps associated with the supply chain. It could be also, where a company works in a broader landscape and is concerned about that broader land or seascape and wants to support, larger level interventions. And so doing nature positive activities can also contribute in that regard, above and beyond the fence line, so to speak, of a company. Biodiversity credits are probably not essential to moving forward with the idea of nature positive, but I think they'll be really helpful. I think that'll be a simplified way and a credible way to make investments and to make contributions and to drive the positive change that we're looking for. So I don't think that it's completely necessary to have a biodiversity crediting scheme in order to make a nature positive contribution. But that said, it can help also reduce possible critiques of greenwashing and other concerns if they're backed up by robust frameworks and transparency and clarity in terms of what they're being used for.
So away from the positive, Tim, if a time traveler from the future told you, 10 years in the future, came back and told you the whole system, the whole enterprise of biodiversity credits has been a total fiasco, it just hasn't worked at all, but they couldn't tell you why, what would your guess be as to why?
Because people are still arguing over what a biodiversity credit is. And I think that's a crucial point, to be honest, because pretty well everybody in this room has a net zero carbon target. And you can achieve that net zero carbon target in many ways. Hopefully you've all stopped buying renewable energy credits now. They were damaged in the market. Sadly, the avoided loss has been very badly damaged, wrongly, but badly damaged in the marketplace. And so if you're going to look to invest in removals, then ecosystem restoration is surely one of the things you should be looking at. And if you're going to do ecosystem restoration, you can quantify what carbon you've got, but why not also quantify the biodiversity gains that you're getting? Now, you may not want to actually monetize those. You may just say, well, okay, we're investing in this project and we've now achieved a 60% increase in biodiversity across 1,000 hectares. And that helps improve the value of your carbon credit. Or you may want to go to the next stage and issue 80% of that claim in individual credits, and that can be done through an organisation called Biodiversity Futures Initiative. That's a grouping of academics that will do independent peer review of biodiversity claims to allow you to do that sort of thing. So the concept of biodiversity credits and trading biodiversity credits, I think it will start, and I think it will grow. But I think what will grow even more is the fact that companies that are already investing in things that are producing a biodiversity uplift, they're going to start quantifying that and reporting it, because they'll then demonstrate that they're having a positive impact on some of their investments that they're making. So it doesn't necessarily need a trading platform in the same way as carbon, but it will need that quantification and publication of how well companies are, how much your investment is impacting on biodiversity and producing uplift.
And Sinclair, what, I guess from your experience of the successes and failures of the voluntary carbon market, what do you think is the most important lesson we can take to make sure that biodiversity credits succeed in their aim?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of lessons learned, including, like you said, both things that have actually worked quite well and things that maybe haven't worked as well, or we had to iterate to get them where they needed to be. And so I think that's exactly it, is that sort of continuous improvement. And understanding that there is no perfect or one solution or approach to go about this. And so there are going to be slightly different approaches, at least in the beginning. And I think we need to have the patience to be able to allow for innovation and testing and iteration, especially when the market's brand new. And I think what we at Verra have learned most recently is that the collaboration and sort of participation by everyone that's involved is really the only thing that can get us to any sort of, correct or appropriate outcome in the end. And still, that will not be perfect, but it's better than doing nothing, and it is actually channeling finance where it's desperately needed. So I would say it's more the soft skills that we need to learn from the carbon market. The technical stuff can be done. There's a ton of smart people in this room and at Climate Week, all talking about technology and the methodological approaches and how you can quantify these things. That's not the part that worries me. It's more about the soft skills, the patience, the participation that is necessary to come together and make progress before there's nothing left to protect.
Thanks. And maybe a follow-up question for you, Sinclair. Based on, as we see carbon, there are lots of different methodologies, and in biodiversity, we're seeing lots of, slightly different but distinct, crediting schemes coming out, all of which differ slightly based on design decisions, such as are you measuring against reference date or from the starting point? Is it percentage uplift? Is it total hectares gained, and so on? How, in the long term, do you think these different standards will converge on one thing? Do you see it as the optimal thing that everyone should kind of follow one standard or align with each other, or do you think they'll end up kind of filling different niches in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think Tim mentioned it earlier. We do need competition. We need some different approaches, especially in this space where we don't have that metric that's sort of very easily applied across the world. So I think we need more than one standard. I don't think we need 20. I think that causes unnecessary confusion in the market, especially at such an early stage. But what I don't want to see is innovation being stifled. None of us have the right answer and never will, and so we need to be testing several different approaches, different technologies in different contexts around the world. Folks like Verra, Plan Vivo, and others are trying to develop globally applicable standards. That's hard to do, and we need to test it in a lot of different contexts to ensure that it's actually applicable in that scale, and will drive finance in a credible way that is inclusive of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and has a good quantification methodology underpinning it. So competition, yes. Multiple standards, yes. Too many will slow us down.
Thanks. I could go on, but are there any questions from the audience? So I want to open up. Yes.
Thanks. Thanks for the very rich presentations. My name is Eveline Trines from Form International, and I have a question on attribution. Biodiversity obviously changes all the time due to many factors, but I imagine that if a company invests and wants to take a biodiversity credit, how do you differentiate between the anthropogenic pressure factors and the non-anthropogenic factors? So meaning if you have biodiversity on a certain plot of land, you've got climate change, nitrogen deposition, water extraction from the neighbors. That's going to affect the amount of biodiversity on the plot. How do you make sure that a biodiversity credit is attributable to the human effort of the intervention? Thank you.
Tim, do you want to? Yeah. Tim, do you want to go first?
Oh, thanks. I'll try and answer that then. Okay, so let's try and think of some practical examples then. Let's, for example, imagine you are restoring riparian forest in a Central American country. So you're going to invest in planting trees 200 meters either side of watercourses in order to try and improve water flows because they've lost so much water there, but to add carbon, but to add biodiversity. And so what you've got to allow for, well, firstly, what you're going to do is measure your biodiversity at the beginning of the project and your carbon at the beginning of the project, and then you're going to measure it over time as the carbon, the biodiversity builds up over time. Now, one of the things that will affect it in the end is climate change, because we're anticipating, for example, in places like Costa Rica and Panama, it'll become gradually drier, they'll have longer dry periods, and this will have an impact on growth rates and potentially on species that can survive. And that's why when you're designing a project like this, your best bet is to go and deal with someone like the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute or CATIA, people that have actually done the studies on which species are most resistant, native species that is, that are most resistant to climate change, to give you the greatest chance of survival. But your question wasn't specifically that, it was how do you separate out climate changes, which may, in some cases, give you an increased biodiversity, not necessarily always a decrease in biodiversity, and what you have done in your project to improve carbon and to improve biodiversity as well. And that's a matter of having, comparative sites. So, for example, if you've we're worried, for example, one of the projects we have is on the Galapagos, where we're working with a team that are releasing some native species back onto Floriana Island after it has been decatted and de-ratted and de-moused. So they've done that work and now they're going to reintroduce those species and get a biodiversity uplift. But that biodiversity uplift will be significantly altered by potential claims in changes in climate. And so that project has a comparative island that they're comparing. They're not comparing the uplift because they're completely different islands, but they're looking at the effect that climate change long-term can have on species in that adjacent island to see if we have to allow for some of those factors that are affecting the biodiversity on Floriana.
Thanks. Anyone else want to add anything on attribution? Or okay. Any questions?
Hi, Sam Lampert from Arova. Another question is around additionality, right? And so how do you see, obviously biodiversity projects have enormous carbon benefits and often carbon projects have enormous biodiversity benefits. How do you see kind of the idea of either stacking them, bundling them, and pulling them apart, and what are the trade-offs associated with it?
Great question. Yeah, so I guess want to start by saying that even though biodiversity credits are not meant to be offsets, the concept of additionality is still very important. We do need to know that we are actually making a change and achieving biodiversity uplift or gain compared to what would have happened otherwise. So you will see that concept in, I think, most of the standards that have been developed so far. However, I think at least the two main ones so far have a simpler approach to additionality when it comes to biodiversity than you generally see in carbon, meaning that it's mostly focused on financial additionality and demonstrating that you need the finance from this mechanism to actually implement the activities that will generate net positive biodiversity outcomes. In carbon, it's a little bit more complex, and we're trying to reduce the burden as much as possible on projects, as long as they are able to demonstrate that these are additional outcomes that wouldn't have occurred without the project. Now, when it comes to the question of stacking or bundling, I think the jury is still out on exactly how it will work, and something we're testing. I know Plan Vivo and Verra are definitely testing this in their pilot projects, but whether we decide that bundling or stacking, for that matter, should be allowed, that decision directly impacts how we design those additionality requirements and frankly any of the requirements in kind of both programs, both standards. They need to be aligned and make sense so that bundling and stacking can actually occur in a credible way and we're not sort of double crediting or double counting those outcomes. Because the idea behind each of these programs or mechanisms is that you're actually working towards net zero when it comes to carbon or working towards net nature positive, if that's how that will end up being defined. And so we want to make sure that we're not kind of fooling ourselves by how much progress we're making towards either of those overarching goals. So it's going to be really important to make sure those additionality requirements align across nature or biodiversity and carbon programs, whichever ones you're using. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more testing that has to be done to figure out exactly how that will work and what will make most sense for projects. I mean, the last thing we want to do is say, sure, go ahead and stack, but actually, in the end of the day, the project receives less funding than they would have if those were sold separately or bundled, and not enough funding than compared to what they need to actually implement the project.
if I can just add to that, I agree entirely on the financial reasons. If you can run a project on carbon alone, then run it on carbon alone. But if that project will not run financially without needing additional income streams like biodiversity, that gives you the additionality. Now, the question is about whether you're going to have separate biodiversity credits or you're going to use them as a way of increasing the value of carbon. And I think you'll see a mix of projects. You'll see some where they think what they want to do is to quantify the biodiversity co-benefits of a carbon credit that's been issued. And they can do that through that Biodiversity Futures Initiative example. So you measure your project, you send all your data into the FI, and they say, okay, you've got a 60% increase over 1,000 hectares in your project. And that's fine. I think a lot of carbon credits could be sold that way and quantify the biodiversity properly. But others, and we're receiving a lot of demands from investors that don't just want to do that. They want to have biodiversity credits themselves issued, and they think the project will be more valuable with separate biodiversity credits and carbon credits. Incidentally, we've never yet found a situation where we're looking to sell them to separate buyers. We're talking about the same buyers in each case. And in those cases, what they can do is take that claim and monetize 80% of it using registration bodies like BitGreen and Verra and SGS and so forth, and issue the credits that way. And I see the market moving in both directions. I can see quantification of biodiversity co-benefits for some projects, and I can see issuance of biodiversity credits for other projects in conjunction with carbon. And don't forget, biodiversity credit gets to places that carbon credits doesn't get to. Because if you're talking about a marine project, other than mangroves, there's very little carbon. But you can fund marine reserves by from the issuance of biodiversity credits, from the uplift in the fisheries and the coral reefs and so forth. So you will have some projects that are only issuing biodiversity credits, but the majority will be issuing both carbon and biodiversity.
You, Steve? Stack, bundle, both, neither?
I agree with Tim. I think it's going to be a mix of both. And I think that there's a really, in spite of what I said at the beginning of my comments about carbon credits not equaling biodiversity credits, there's a lot to be learned from what we've done so far in both the processes behind carbon credits, but also the very credits themselves. And that premium for biodiversity so far that I see is mostly just talked about anecdotally as a nice to have. So I think that there's a really ripe space to start to look at that premium and start to understand the value of it from a biodiversity perspective, but also then from a financial perspective. And that can be part of the learning space that we use to advance as we look at standalone biodiversity credits, where now we may be having discussions, as you alluded to there, Tim, that biodiversity is the main driver and carbon becomes the co-benefit, in fact. And so that would be actually a nice place to be. Or we may find some cases of interventions that are currently underway that are driven for carbon purposes, which would be actually much more beneficial for biodiversity. And so I think that there is a lot that we can do in this area, and we should take advantage of opportunities to learn from what we already have. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is it's a question for the carbon world as well, for both carbon and biodiversity credits, but it's how you integrate, well, maybe in terms of, I mean, obviously human rights and free and private forms of consent go into all of them. Something that's come up in the design of carbon credits and biodiversity credits is how you make them accessible. Because there are competing trade-offs. So on the one hand, you want to make these technically rigorous, but you also need to make them accessible so that local communities can benefit from them. What are some ways we can do that? How do we balance that trade-off?
I'm a firm believer, to be honest, that you set a target for how much finance for credits are going to local stakeholders, owners, users, managers of those local sites. We use the Plan Vivo approach of 60% for the issuance price. But since we're running projects where we're issuing credits at below market rates, if we're not careful, that's going to cheat the communities. So we insist that on the sale of those, the resale of those credits, 60% of any profit is then donated back to those local stakeholders. So you don't lose any benefit by coming in at a lower price on the marketplace. I always get kickback when I say this, and people say, well, you can't always, and it's possible you won't always be able to do it, but that ought to be your major target. I always think, well, if you're not saying 60%, what are you saying? So what you're going to have to then say was, oh, okay, you've got a project now, it's got 15% going to local communities. Is that sufficient? 20%, 25%. It's useful to have a target and make sure, incidentally, that money is not just going to individuals, it's being spread amongst that community. But if you've got a target like that, there may be occasions when you can't achieve it, and then you're going to have to use a different approach. But the vast majority of cases, you can achieve that. And it's a way in which significant amounts of money can be put into these local communities to help them.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, because it is hard to figure out what is the right benchmark or kind of goal to push projects to, and I agree that it's helpful to have some kind of target and guidance. But I also want to emphasize the importance of the design and the inclusion in developing that design and engagement plan, and the design of the overarching project and its implementation. So having engagement, participation from all stakeholders, especially local communities, in that process at the very beginning of the project is super important. I think Naomi was talking about it a little bit earlier on I think it was RED panel, and quality and how important that participation and FPIC is, but not just at the very beginning. It's an ongoing process, right? So even if there are issues that happen or come up in projects, as can do, you never know what's going to happen in a project, including natural disasters that kind of take the project on track. You need to have a mechanism in place to be able to address those issues and have the right participation and engagement to do so. So whether that's grievance redress mechanisms or a specific threshold for benefit sharing, I think it really comes down to what is the appropriate design and plan for those things that can only be well established with participation from all stakeholders.
Thanks. And then maybe one kind of final question is, obviously we have we're starting to get a sense of what a credit might look like and how a project supplier of credits might go about doing it. What are the three of you seeing initially in terms of demand side? Maybe starting with Steve, who is interested in buying biodiversity credits, or who do you think it'll be? Is it large philanthropy? Is it big companies? Is it small projects themselves that want to invest in?
I think one of the potentially appealing aspects of biodiversity credits is that it could be in demand by a lot of different groups. You could imagine if there's a focus towards conserving certain species, that people would be interested in purchasing credits like that. It could be appealing, as the example I mentioned earlier, for a company wanting to enhance the management of nature in a landscape or seascape where they're present. Then it could be appealing in that regard. And it could also be tied in with the existing purchasers of carbon credits for these additional values that it can have. But the question about demand is still, to my knowledge, unclear, and that really needs to be looked at and understood a lot better as we advance in these discussions. It's fine and important to work on the supply side, the methodologies, the frameworks, and have a clearer understanding of what these are going to look like. It's also important to understand, as we talked about up here already, about the fact that biodiversity credits shouldn't be used to offset negative impacts. And so that's going to have a pretty substantial effect on demand as well. And so I'm looking forward to learning more as we talk with more companies about what are their interests in this space. Thank you.
Because we're running projects, we're coming across this demand side all the time. So we're routinely dealing now with 40 corporates and funds that are looking for projects that have got biodiversity elements to them. Now what we find is if you've got a project that's got carbon and biodiversity, it's definitely more attractive. Everybody needs carbon. A lot of people want biodiversity. So if the carbon and biodiversity are priced properly, that then becomes a very attractive offer, because they know eventually they're going to need to demonstrate some biodiversity uplift. So it's useful if you've invested in a project that's restored an ecosystem, got you some carbon, but you've also quantified the biodiversity as well. So I see that as quite a big driver of this demand. And the demand is coming, yes, partly from corporates, because they have to report. Once you have to report, you have to measure. Once you have to measure, you realise what a mess you're making of things, and you're going to have to do something about this. But it's also coming from investment funds. And investment funds are seeing this as a much wider secondary market potentially than carbon, because nobody loves a ton of carbon dioxide. It's just not sexy. But increases in biodiversity are of much greater appeal. And we see the secondary market, the small and medium-sized enterprises, even individuals in the general public, as Steve was alluding to, may well be interested in investing in projects where you can actually quantify that biodiversity uplift. So the message I would take from here is demand is not the problem, it's supply. I was at a conference in Cambridge a couple of weeks ago with lots of NGOs from across Europe and lots of funders there. And one of the funders stood up and said, look, you're all talking about this stuff, but there's not a single project on biodiversity uplift that's available to fund today. Not one. That's the problem. We're short of supply, we're not short of demand.
Well, good news is that we had 179 projects apply to pilot our framework, and I know other standards out there have had a number of pilots apply as well. So hopefully that problem will resolve itself over the next several months. It does take time to develop these projects, but I'm confident that there are enough signals and kind of projects in the pipeline to help generate the credits and hopefully meet that demand.
Great. Thank you all very much. And yeah, thanks to our speakers, and yeah, enjoyed that. And yeah, look forward to discussing afterwards.